Welcome everyone. We're really excited to be able to have Fatima with us here today and to be able to do something in person. We've so missed being able to see people's faces. And yesterday I attended a talk by Professor Brooks, who talks about happiness. And he was talking about how much oxytocin you get just from eye contact. So here we are. You're actually going to be getting an increased dose of oxytocin just by attending this session. Welcome to our discussion of Fatima Samar's new book, Development Diplomat. My name is Salimah Samji, and I am the Director of Building State Capability at CID. Joining us virtually, we have participants from 23 countries today. The format of today's session will be as follows. I will introduce Fatima, and then we will have a discussion, and then open it up for a Q&A session. Fatima will also be signing books. You can see that there's books here at the end of the session. For our virtual participants, please put your questions in the chat. Claire is monitoring the chat, so please, whatever comments or questions you have, please make sure you put them in the chat. For those of you who are present, when we get to the Q&A session, you can just raise your hand and we'll pass the microphone. We have to use microphones so that everyone on Zoom can hear them. Okay, without further ado, welcome Fatima. It's an honor to have you here with us today. Fatima Samar is the Vice President of Compact Operations at the Millennium Challenge Corporation and author of Development Diplomat, working across borders, boardrooms, and bureaucracies to end poverty. She has traveled to more than 60 countries. She has visited half of them while officially representing the US government. She has worked as a civil servant at the State Department, on Capitol Hill, and most recently at Oxfam America, based here in Boston. During her work, she observed how foreign policy officials and development officials often share the same goals, but focus on different areas. Development experts focus on economic growth, inequality, promoting democracy, and good governance. Foreign policy officials, or diplomats, value strategic alliances, promoting security and stability to advance their political agenda. When these two groups come together, transformative change can happen. When they talk past each other and fail to understand the language and culture of their counterparts, the moment to fight poverty at scale can be lost in a heartbeat. Having worked in both fields, Fatima saw her role to translate across teams and build bridges to find creative ways forward. A roadmap of shared language, priorities, timelines, terms of financing, and policy reforms to advance anti-poverty efforts. She is a development diplomat. Welcome, Fatima. So let's get started. I wanted to start off by asking you, what was your motivation for writing this book?
Well, first, I'm just really delighted to be here with all of you. Salimah, thank you so much for hosting today's event. I'm really grateful to Harvard Kennedy Center for International Development, Kennedy's Women in Public Policy program. I'm so grateful to all of you that could take time to come and be here with us in person. I'm so grateful to all of you online, as Salimah said, representing more than 23 countries to have what I think is a really global conversation, right? And so first I want to say, when I wrote this book and I sat down during COVID to think about how I could start putting pen to paper, I really wanted to think about sharing my perspectives from the US government, and that's what we'll talk about, and that's what the book largely describes. But I actually think the lessons in it are applicable across the world, across countries, across governments, whether you end up working in government, whether you end up in a country's multilateral institution, whether you end up at local levels, private sector, or civil society, the lessons apply. So one of the things that happened during COVID is the world shut down, right, for all of us and for many of us. And as I thought about my career largely in the US government space, and I had all these crazy different adventures, some highs, some lows, as the book describes, I thought about back to when I was 18, and then 21, and then 25, when I really started out my own career, and I said to myself, I want to make a difference in the world. I am born and bred to do that. It's how my family grew up. It's how I was ingrained from a very young age to think about the impact I could have to help people all around the world. But I didn't really always understand how to do that. Like, how do I translate that vision into something concrete. What are the different pathways out there professionally and personally, right? And so what I actually decided to do during COVID, as the world shut down, is I decided to take a writing course. And I went back to school, literally online, largely with 20-year-olds, which was very humbling for me. And I learned a lot because you have no fear. You have no fear, and I have a lot more fear than all of you, you know? And it really pushed me outside of my boundaries. And I started thinking, what if I just write down some of these stories and what I wish I knew when I was in your shoes? And so I literally decided to write the stories that I wish I knew when I was 25, starting out my own career, and the stuff that no one teaches you when you're in school. So when I was in school, in both undergraduate and graduate spaces, just studying international relations, public policy, economic policy, I studied statistics, economics, public policy, psychology, international relations. Does any of this sound familiar? Yes? So that's what I studied. I wrote all the fake memos to the fake president of the United States with my policy recommendations. If the fake president had listened to me, I would have solved many crises in 2 pages for the world. So I'm sorry those memos never really made it through to the National Security Council. But at the end of the day, what they don't teach you is the spaces in between the fields you are studying. The human-to-human interactions, the emotional intelligence, the bureaucracies that you're going to be dealing with, the politics, the money, challenges around diversity, challenges around being a woman in the room, challenges around being a minority in the room. Those are the spaces that have been my journey for the last 15, 20 years, and I wanted to kind of capture that for all of you. And so I literally wrote this with all of you in mind. And before we start talking a little bit more about the book, I promised my sister I would do this, and I'm keeping my word in every book talk so far, Salimah. So this has been a dream of mine to write for many years. I'm proud that I finally did it. I had to juggle it with many other things, including 3 kids. When I finally published it earlier, about a month ago, my sister, I'm going to show this to all of you, and I'm going to ask you a little warm up before we start. And for those of you online, you can play along as well. My sister gave me this as a gift, and it's 3-dimensional. You can all see it, right? And it has the title, and then it has praise quotes from different people who sent in early praise quotes. And then I said, thank you so much. I love it. I'm going to take it with me in all my book talks, which is what I'm doing. But then she looked at me and she said, no, but do you get what it is? What is it? And I said, no, it's this lovely gift. I love it. And she's like, no, what is it? So I'm going to ask all of you. Any of you know what this is? And I'll pass it around. And for those of you online, you can see the different sides to it and get the gist. You can pass it around. Anyone want to take a guess what it is? I'm at Harvard. I wore crimson because I know I'm with the best of the best and the brightest in the world. So you have to prove that you're the best of the best here. Who knows what this is? So what's your name? Mackenzie came up with building block. And on the chat, feel free to put in ideas or answers on the chat.
Claire, just raise your hand if you want to.
Michaela came up with a die. Anyone else? Anyone else want to wager a guess?
Someone said Pandora's box.
A Pandora's box, building block, a die.
Reflection cube. A reflection.
A reflection cube. Can I hold it up for one more moment, and then I'll keep passing it around. All right. So some of you're getting there. What shape is it? What else? Someone actually said the word. Block. It's writer's block. I'll keep passing this around so you can see it. But I just wanted to share that because as all of you also think about your careers, as we think about this journey that we're about to talk about, sometimes the hardest part isn't the passion, isn't the excitement, isn't your ambition or drive. It's the humor to actually find space and courage to carve out time to do what you care about. And so I just wanted to share that moment of levity with all of you.
Thank you very much. You have an incredible career trajectory, and I was wondering if you could just talk us through, you are at Princeton for your graduate program, and you're looking to get into the State Department. how did you, like, where did you begin?
So how many of you are focused on international relations diplomacy on that side of shop? A couple of you. And on the chat, please feel free to participate and share with us as well. How many of you are focused on the development side? Economics. Okay. So here's my thesis, and this is how I started out my career journey. My thesis was, when I was 17 years old and in college as a freshman, they were like, what do you want? You have to kind of decide what you want to do. And I was like, I don't know. I'm really interested in history, politics, law, the world at large. So I picked something pretty generic as international relations, right? Any of you familiar with that journey? Yeah. Okay, so that's what I did. And then when I graduated from college, I actually ended up doing domestic policy work. Not because of any interest, actually, just because it was the first job I got, and I promised my mother I would take the first job I got. That's what I did. And then what happened is that a couple years in, I loved what I was doing, but it wasn't my real passion, and I wanted to go back. But to get a job back without the experience, or to get into grad school without the experience, becomes the cycle you can't get out of, right? Because then they say you need the experience, right? We all know the cycle. It's very hard, right? If you don't have the internships or the experience. So I applied to public policy programs and law schools, got into different programs. A professor of mine told me, pick the thing you're most passionate about, and if you want to change public policy, go to public policy school. She said, why do you want to go to law school? And I said, to change policy. She said, so go to policy school to do that. So I did that, and I only looked at programs that accepted both domestic and international fields. Harvard had a program like that, as many of you know, because you're in it. Princeton has a program like that, and a few other programs also have domestic and international. And I did that because I applied as a domestic student. I did not apply as an international student because I didn't have the credentials to get in. And when I got in, I got to a couple different programs, including at Princeton. I walked over to the admissions director's office, and I said, I have to confess. I have a confession to make. I got in as a domestic student to U.S. domestic policy, but it's not what I want to do. And he walked me over to his computer. He opened up a spreadsheet, and I thought he was going to reject me on the spot. And I had that moment where I was like, I was too honest here. I should have graduated and then told him, right? And he actually just went to the spreadsheet and unilaterally changed me from domestic to international.
Before you even started.
Before I even started. This is a math camp. And he said to me, we don't care what you want to study, we care what you want to do. And it's your journey that we want to support. And so I want to apply that forward to all of you, where that's something that actually, that resonated with me. It still resonates with me today, that it's not about which field you choose in this moment in your careers. It's not about your first internship, your first job. I started out at the State Department as a presidential management fellow. I started down the foreign policy side, hardcore. I never took a single development course in my entire training, undergrad or graduate school, because I didn't have to. Honestly, I just didn't have to, so I didn't. And I took all the things I had to take to graduate with an IR degree, a public policy degree on foreign policy and national security. And I went down that rabbit hole because it was easy to do. It was all kind of laid out for you and prescribed to do, and so I did. The thing is, God willing, with your health, if you are able to live to 80 or 100 or 120, you're going to be working for 60 years of your life. This is very depressing to me. Okay, right? You have a long journey ahead of you. All of us do. So you're going to start out here today, and you don't know where you're going to end up tomorrow and the day after that. So you really want to think about preparing yourselves for wherever that journey can take you. And so I started out squarely on the foreign policy side. And I only got to the development side actually by accident, because I ended up first as a PMF at the State Department. I then transitioned using my PMF, because you get 2 rotations if you take that fellowship anywhere in the US government, or actually only you can do multilaterals. There's many places you can go. And I went to the Hill because I wanted to see what life was like, how to do foreign policy on the other side, how to actually get the money, the budgets, the legislative authorities. And so I went to the Hill, and I loved it. And I loved it. I literally fell in love with the Hill. I was 25 again, I would go back to the Hill. No job security, no pay, but
And of why do that? Was it you were unhappy, you say you wanted to try something different? What was the motivation for wanting to move to the Hill, and then explaining how you got that job?
Yeah, okay. So for those of you in the room, take a copy, because you can read along with me for a couple pieces of this. And for those of you online, I'll tell you the page numbers in case you have the book. We can go from there. But on page 99, beginning of chapter 3, when I got the job on the Hill, so the first time I was on the Hill, I went as a PMF. The second time, Salimah, I went to the Hill, I went to join the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Yeah, I spent 5 years in the committee. A job was never, the entire time I was there, I don't think we ever posted a single job, right? There was never a job description that went out to say, apply, we have an opening. That's not how jobs happened on the Hill back in the day, right? It happened through word of mouth, through networks. Now, I'm a first generation immigrant. My parents are from South Asia and Southeast Asia. They came, very typical South Asian story, a lot of struggles coming in the 70s, very little resources. My family grew up in generational poverty. When they came here, and as I was growing up, we didn't have connections, we didn't have networks, they were not political operatives, they weren't donors. Voting in a presidential election was kind of like the height of our civic duty as a family growing up. And that was kind of it. So I had no clue how to navigate the Hill at all. And I got into SFRC, which was where I spent the next 5 years, really by accident. And I write this story, and I'm going to tell you the backstory because I didn't write the full story. So let me tell you a little bit of the backstory, but it's on page 99 for those of you that are in the book. I was back at the State Department, and I got an email from then Senator Kerry's chief of staff. And I didn't know him, and he didn't know me. And he basically said, I got your resume. Do you want to come in and talk? So I write this story starting on chapter 3 of how I ended up in the Senate Gardens with David McCain, who I did not know and who did not know me at all, after we got evacuated unceremoniously from a fire alarm where the Senate and Capitol Police evacuated everybody for a fire. And we ended up in the gardens.
And this is your interview.
I didn't even know it was an interview. I didn't even know what this was. And we ended up under these oak trees. And he said, I've got 3 minutes left before my next meeting. What can I do for you? And I didn't even know what this was. Was this a conversation, an interview? I had no clue what was happening. And I have to say, in that moment, I decided I have nothing to lose. I got nothing to lose. I don't even know why I'm here. I'm under a tree. I don't understand what any of this is. And I said, David, I hear through the rumor mill, Senator Kerry may be the incoming chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, because this was December 2008, right after Senator Obama won the presidential election. In the US context, when the White House is won, that's not the only thing that changes. It changes many things across the board, including Congress, right? So who was the Foreign Relations chairman at the time? It was Joe Biden. He goes over to become vice president, so there's an opening for the chairmanship. It goes by hierarchy. Next in line is supposed to be Senator Dodd, Chris Dodd on SFRC, should become the incoming chairman. But it's the financial crisis of 2008. And so he goes and takes over the banking committee instead, which is a very high profile place to be when the country's melting down in liquidity. And so the next in line is John Kerry. The rumor had it that he was going to be the next chairman of SFRC. I figured I had nothing to lose. My 3 minutes in the garden with David McCain, I asked him if he would hire me. And he said, I'll let you know. Right? Within days, he sent me an email asking me to meet with then Senator Kerry. I ended up in his office for close to an hour, where he grilled me on my experiences in Afghanistan. I had served there as part of my presidential management fellowship in Kabul, and he grilled me on the war. And I decided again, another Hail Mary, I've got nothing to lose. And I said, I think we're losing the war. And this is back in 2008, sorry. I think we're losing the war. And within days, I got an email with a job offer. And it meant giving up a career job in the civil service at the State Department with, a kind of defined promotion pattern. I knew when I would get promoted. I knew I'd get paid. I had all the benefits of a career civil servant. To give that up for a political job on the Hill where you have no guarantees, you can get fired without cause at any point, at any time. Maybe you screw up, or maybe they're bored of you, or maybe they just don't need you anymore, right? I didn't know what the job was going to be. I had very little information coming in because he wasn't chairman. So it was all a gamble that he would get the chairmanship, that he'd get to move around spots in the committee with the budget, and that he'd have a role for me. And I had, I think, a day to turn around and answer. And I had a new baby. My eldest at that point was just a few months old. My husband was still in law school. We had no money. I think we were completely broke.
And still you made that decision.
Said, are you crazy to give up this job? And I said, I got nothing to lose. And he's like, you have everything to lose. And I have to say, like, sometimes you got to dig deep for what it is you really want to do. And in that moment, I felt, and I was very young at the time, but I felt like this was a guy who's going to have a perch to make a difference in the world, and I could help him do that. And I wanted to take the chance. And it could have gone very wrong. In my case, I got lucky that it went right.
Serendipity. Luck is really important in life as well. You tell another really great story about how you ended up going on to visit Afghanistan with Senator Kerry. How did that come about?
Yeah, so one of the first times I got to go on official travel, it's called a CODEL. And one of the things the book does for all of you is I literally write out how these bureaucracies work, how these acronyms work, because I didn't know any of this when I started out my career in either the legislative or executive branch. And then you kind of have to learn on the job, and it can take you 6 months, a year to figure out the basics. So I hope this fast forwards it, at least for some of you, as you start some of this line of work. And even if you're not in these jobs, you're going to know people in these jobs. So it helps to know on the other side, right, how a lot of this stuff works. So the way it works in the Senate is that members of the Senate can travel. They're called CODELs, Congressional Delegations. They often travel during recesses, the congressional recess period. I thought recess was like playground recess in the beginning, and as a young mom, this made me very excited to know that we had carved out recess play dates for the kids, but that is not what we mean when we talk about congressional recesses, to be clear. But that's when members travel often overseas or across the country. And so he had a trip planned for the Columbus Day recess. This is back in 2009, in fall 2009. And I never took for granted that I'd get to travel with them. And traveling with a member is really the way to solidify a relationship with them, to get to be there for key issues, to meet in-country staff at our embassies overseas. And we're sitting in one of the hearings that he chaired on Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is my portfolio. And the way the committee room works, if you're in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I'm going to show you this because I think visuals matter. So we're going to pretend, Salimah, be the chairman for the chairwoman for me for a moment here.
All right.
And I'll be your staffer. So if you were in the US Senate, in the Senate Dirksen building in room 419, you would all be in this committee room right now. This is the table where all the members are based here. And the chairman or chairwoman in this case would sit here. And then in this case, it's, and then her party would sit this way. The ranking would sit over here, and his or her party would sit that way. The staff comes up through a dais in the back. And then you sit behind your member by rank, order of rank. Now, if there's other people, I was the most junior member of the committee at that point, so for the chairman. So if my bosses are there, then they would sit to the left of me in front of the chairman. Does that make sense in terms of everything's hierarchy and rank, right? So I'm a junior staff at this moment, and we're in a committee hearing. You're testifying, and you're testifying on very important issues. The rest of you are listening and diligently taking notes. And what often happens during these hearings is even as the senators are listening and absorbing the information and preparing for their own testimony, they're also processing how they're going to handle a certain issue with their staff. And so there's a lot of actual dialogue that happens between the members and their staff. So in this one example, and it's in the book, actually, it's in, I think, chapter 4 of the book, where this example takes place. If you'll be the honorable chairman for a moment here, Salimah. I was sitting here in a hearing listening, and my boss, David McCain, who was the staff director of the committee, the same one I was under the oak trees with in the garden, he whispered to me, he leaned over and whispered, and he said, you know, the senator is going to the region soon for the recess. and region means Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I nodded my head. And then he just said, do you want to go with him? And I didn't even know he was talking to me. Like I just kept looking around to be like, who is he talking to? Because it can't be me, right? It must be like other people on the committee, some of my superiors, but I can't believe that he's talking to me and asking me. I didn't even know he like barely knows my name, right? At this point in our relationship. And, you know, so I'm on the spot. I think my daughter at this point is 7 months old, my first. I have no plan for child. I have like nothing. And I just was like, yes, right? I haven't talked to my husband. I haven't figured any of this out. And I just said, I just nodded my head yes. He writes a note to the chairman. He scribbles a note, folds it up. The chairman swirls around. I remember he took his glasses off. He looks down on me. I'm like having a heart attack over here, right? I don't even know if he knows who I am at this point, really, if he remembers, right? And he looks at me and he says, are you coming with me? And I just nod my head yes. And he goes, all right. And he turns back around. And 2 weeks later, I'm on the plane with him to Kabul. And there are 2-3 chapters in the book devoted to that story of what happened in that presidential election in Afghanistan back in 2009, and how pivotal it really was for both Afghanistan's history and world history, and the critical role that Senator Kerry played at that point in averting a constitutional crisis in Afghanistan. And because of that scene, I was in the room during all of those negotiations in the presidential palace with President Karzai and others, seeing how history gets made behind the scenes. And I share a lot of what that's actually like, the highs and the lows of that entire experience. But it's sometimes, you know, how those experiences even come about some of it's luck and serendipity. And then some of that's also just, you know, being decisive at the right moment and praying you don't get divorced, right? Like on the back end, and that you can figure out childcare and everything else, which really is a sub-theme of mine throughout this book of how do you actually handle this if you want to have a personal life at the same time? Because the tolls can be very exacting, and it's not just about you and your career, it involves your entire family. In my case, my extended family as well.
Was it your mother or your mother-in-law who came in to?
Yeah, both. At both different points in time, everyone had to fly in. It was an all hands on deck to raise my kids.
To help you raise your kids. And then if you could just share a little how you then ended up at MCC. So, you know, you're working on the Hill and then there's another opportunity that comes up.
So I'll back up a little bit just for context. So I started in foreign policy, as I told all of you, right? And then I write in the book, well, how did I get to development? And what is the space between development and diplomacy, right? And the reason I got into development is really odd. I have a very odd story. And it was basically this. On the committee, I had oversight, not just of US foreign policy, but I had oversight of the assistance budgets of everything happening in the region that I had oversight for, which was Afghanistan, Pakistan, South Central Asia. Well, at the height of the US wars in Afghanistan, we're talking over $6 billion of US foreign aid was coming to that region that I had oversight for. That's money from USAID largely, NCC, and other smaller development agencies, right? And all of a sudden, I have to be the one to say, is taxpayer dollars being effectively spent in this region, and provide that recommendation up to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, right? So with all of my robust development training, right, that I did not have, I literally had to learn on the job. And I had to figure out, how does USAID work in particular? How are development dollars supposed to be spent? And what does it mean to have impact? So even if you spend the money, how do I know that the money was well spent for US taxpayers, right? And that was this, you know, very intense effort. And I did that through lots of different ways, largely through committee hearings, bringing up, asking US aid to come over and over again to explain to me what they were doing. I traveled a lot to figure some of that out. And as I did that, I launched all these congressional investigations because I had the entire money trail. And I'll give you, one piece of advice for all of you as you're thinking about your careers: follow the money. Literally, follow the money, and it will lead you to many. Everything else is words, right? Money is where all that impact actually lies. And so I had access to a lot of the documentation, all of the documentation really, I read it. I read every single audit report, every single Inspector General report, every single M&E report, monitoring and evaluation report that came out. Anything I could find, I read, I cataloged, and I started putting congressional investigations together. And Chapter 7 is actually all about one of the biggest congressional investigations that I launched. It became breaking news when it was launched in June 2011, because it basically critiqued US foreign policy and development assistance in Afghanistan. And coming from a Democratic Senate to a Democratic White House, you can imagine how popular we were in DC political parlance. But it was a result of a lot of this investigation that was pooled. And I started thinking to myself, it's one thing to have an oversight role and capacity and to critique. It's actually very easy to critique, let's be honest, right? Because you can poke holes in a lot of things, and it's much easier to be in an oversight capacity. But I wondered, I always use this cake analogy, Salimah, right? There's like different parts of the cake. You can eat a cake and taste it. So as an oversight person, I was judging the cake and basically being like, do I like it? Do I think the baker did a good job? Does it meet my standards? Did they spend the right amount of money for quality? You can be the one that designs the cake as a policy person and basically says the cake, we should have a cake for this event. That's a policy decision that we should have a cake. And as a foreign policy person, you can say every region we work in should have cake. Or I could be on the development side and design the cake. I could kind of think about, is it a wedding cake or is it a birthday cake? How many layers does it need to have? Does it rise? Should it be a rainbow cake? Does it have sprinkles, etc.? And I wanted to understand different layers of this cake. So I'd seen it from the judging role. I had seen it from the policy role of the foreign policy side, and I wanted to see it from the development side. So when I got an opportunity, and I write about the story in some of the later chapters of how I got offered the job at MCC, because again, I think it's really important to be transparent how to get jobs, not just what you do in jobs. I wanted to see what it would take to design the cake, literally, so to speak. And so that's why I went, and that's why I came back to MCC when the Biden-Harris administration asked to come back.
Oh, thank you very much. In your book, you mention, and I'm quoting from your book, sustainable development depends on securing political buy-in, which often requires partnering more broadly with political leaders, foreign affairs ministries, opposition, political parties, etc., and getting all parties to agree to a single development strategy and timeline grounded in data and evidence, which could survive politically without politicizing the aid, was not always easy. Can you share an example in your book that kind of tells that story?
Okay, so if you have the book, for those of you that have a copy of the book, I'm going to look at Chapter 9, which is called Negotiating a Deal in the Bazaar, and starts on page 229. So let me give you the quick context, though, and for those of you following along, let me give you the quick context here. This is a deal. I spent 2 chapters talking about this deal. It's called CASA 1000. It's still a live thing that's happening right now in the world. It stands for Central Asia, South Asia 1000, for the 1,000 megawatts that could get transferred ultimately to Pakistan to deal with its energy deficit from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, the Central Asian countries, because of their hydro surplus, right? This is a deal 30 years in the making, okay? And so one of the things this book spends a lot of time talking about is not just what is the right development policy, that we should have clean energy or that we should have deal X or Y. It really talks about what does it take to make the deal happen? And what is the in-between space between foreign policy and international development where those conversations actually have to take place for this to happen? So CASA 1000 is a perfect example of this. It's a development deal that was actually thought up in the 90s by the Russians originally, actually, and then really thought, economists from the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, ran the feasibility studies on it and found that the merits of it were actually quite sound from an economic and technical perspective, right? The concept made a lot of sense. You have all the surplus hydro up here from the Pamirs. You could export that through Afghanistan into energy-starved Pakistan. So that's the economic modeling. It makes sense. What's the problem? What's the problem? Anyone want to guess what the problem is?
There were issues with, there were a lot of operational challenges, primarily coming from like bilateral tensions between Pakistan and Pakistan. And then on the Pakistani end, there were a lot of like regulatory uncertainties and like financial risks involved. Sorry. With the commitments that like the government could give as well, and just a lot of like bureaucratic delays and a lack of like follow up in the project. Alina, I'm from Pakistan. I've worked a little bit on the deal. I worked as a political risk analyst focused on Pakistan and Afghanistan.
I would love, tell me what you think about these chapters, Alina. So Alina gave a very, very detailed on the operational level of some of the challenges between Afghanistan and Pakistan. To simplify, there's a war going on right in the middle of this deal, right? You have an active war zone in Afghanistan. You have a lot of regional mistrust between all of the countries, actually, historically, and because exacerbated through the war. Central Asian countries, there's a lot of distrust with Afghanistan, between Afghanistan and Pakistan, et cetera, et cetera. So look, you have a sound economic development deal on paper. It's been designed in the 90s, in the 2000s. When I got this job back at the State Department, I went from the Senate when Senator Kerry then became Secretary of State in the US State Department. I joined his team, and I ended up being in charge of actually putting together the regional economic connectivity, a new Silk Road for the US government, connecting Central Asia through South Asia via Afghanistan. This was a policy speech that Secretary Clinton had announced for the US government in June 2011, right? I always think when you give a big speech like that, when any principal gives a really big speech, my job is the next day to figure out how to make it real, right? How do you take the speech, which sounds great and has all this ambition and how the world should work, and then whose job is it to figure out how to make it real? Our job. That's what we do. That's what we were trained to do, right? So that's the job I got, was to take the speech and the vision and make it real for Secretary Kerry. So I got all my teams together and I said, what could we do? And the deal that was top of the list that could be real was CASA 1000. But how to make it real politically, the space between development and diplomacy, how to make that real was a real challenge. The World Bank was perplexed and stumped. The ADB was perplexed and stumped. The 4 CASA countries had their own national interests in how to make it real. We had a CASA secretariat. We had hundreds of people working on this in the 4 countries, in the major donor agencies like DFID, the World Bank, ADB, bilaterally in governments like the UK, the US, hundreds and hundreds of people working years on this deal. So that's the context really quickly. I'm not going to read all of it because of time, but I'll skim through parts of it. But I start out the chapter on 229, basically talking about, any of you ever bargained for things like rugs or anything else, like South Asian, Central Asian bargaining? We all know, yeah? So I write what some of those dynamics are like, right? But the basic gist of this, and I won't read all of it, but the basic gist of it is that you walk in, you want the carpet, you bid super low, the seller acts super offended, right? The buyer threatens to be offended in kind, everyone threatens to walk away and be super offended. Then you come back, you make a more reasonable offer, he or she counters. Eventually you meet somewhere in the middle, you get the rug, you're best friends all of a sudden, you had like 8 cups of tea together. He invites you to his son's wedding, right? At the end of it, like, it's more than a rug, you've built a lifelong relationship here. You take his business card and now you're giving it to all your other friends, and that relationship goes on and on, right? So I write about that story, and I'm saying this a little bit in jest, but actually, a lot of cultural bargaining actually applies politically as well, right? And I kind of wanted to test that out. Is that true in a deal like CASA 1000? So I start the chapter that way. And I wanted to see, it works for buying a carpet. Does it work for selling electricity in the region? And so then the story goes, it's $1 billion deficit to get to the deal. So the financing gap is $1 billion to put CASA 1000 together. We think the World Bank can do some of it. We're not sure if the US, the Brits, and the others can do some of it. I come into this in the middle of all of this. I get my teams together, and I'm on page 231. Throughout 2014, my State Department and USAID colleagues and I worked closely together with the World Bank and our Central Asian partners to make CASA 1000 a reality. We made significant progress in fall 2013 by securing US grant financing for the deal. The previous chapter is about that story. Now, with the narrow political window to make progress, we needed to secure formal approval from the World Bank, fill the rest of the $1 billion financing gap, and have all 4 countries agree on the pricing for electricity trade. Work the phones, set up meetings, and get out cables. I instructed my teams across the State Department and USAID as we look for ways to get CASA 1000 moving. And let's get on planes if we need to. Let's get this done. Despite the considerable stress of leaving my kids behind again, I traveled to London, Brussels, Berlin, Moscow, Tashkent, Tirmez, Ashgabat, Baku, Almaty, Dushanbe, Kathmandu, Muscat, and Istanbul that year to advance diplomatic negotiations on the project and other regional initiatives. I also focused on development diplomacy in Washington. The first order of business required convincing the State Department to raise CASA 1000 as a top economic priority in the region. I partnered with I talked about Robin Rafel in here, and I partnered with her and Afghanistan, Pakistan, what we called back in the day the SRAP teams, to send out cables to US embassies in the region, demarching or tasking them to highlight CASA 1000 as our signature regional development priority in their bilateral meetings with regional governments. We asked our British friends to do the same in their diplomacy since they also supported the project. In due course, US and British ambassadors and their teams, alongside senior World Bank officials in Dushanbe, Bishkek, Kabul, and Islamabad, repeatedly raised CASA 1000 in their meetings with regional leaders, encouraging them to go forward. I go on to describe the political momentum that was growing in the region that became organic, led by leaders such as President Karzai, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, President Rahmon from Tajikistan, and we hit a major milestone with that March 2014, the World Bank secured over $500 million and committed it from their IDA funding. But we still needed to find another $500 million to pay for the rest of the gap. So I talk about calling up Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, which is where the Islamic Development Bank is, and asking to really do a full court press with the IDB, taking a few pages from John Kerry's diplomatic playbook. Eventually, it worked. We cheered when we filled that $500 million gap, and within 1 year, we filled a $1 billion financing gap for this project. I go on to talk about the Uzbeks, which are not part of the deal, but they're a neighboring country. And for all of you that know about riparian water issues and how important it is to make sure that neighbors are not pissed off when you actually put other deals together and development projects together, what it takes to do the political negotiations to bring alongside other countries such as the Uzbeks. So the last piece was actually getting the countries back to my carpet bazaar to figure out the price of electricity trade. So we filled the financing gap. We have addressed some of the concerns from neighbors like Uzbekistan. But we now have to get the 4 countries to agree on the price for electricity trade. Now, if you were doing this in one of your courses, right, you would do economic modeling and you would figure out the right price for electricity that made sense as the seller and the buyer. So our teams at the World Bank and other places did that, and we had the economic modeling. But now you have to sell that politically to the political leadership of these 4 countries, each one who wants to make sure they're not getting screwed, literally. It's as simple as that. And that they're getting a good deal and that they can sell it to their own domestic constituents. Does this sound familiar? Right? This is where the art of development diplomacy really comes in. It's the politics, it's the negotiations, it's the psychology, it's the emotional intelligence, it's the cultural diversity pieces, right? And so I go on to describe how the entire deal almost fell apart because the countries did not trust each other at that point in time, and we're not sure that the price as the seller, to you, the buyer, was a fair price. And what it took, we set up meetings in Georgetown, in the Four Seasons. We set up meetings at the State Department with these formal diplomatic receptions to kind of raise the flag, to wave the flags and get everyone on board when finance ministers came to visit the United States. We traveled to Istanbul and other places, and I go through some of those negotiations of how to do that. At the end of the day, we secured the pricing deal between the Afghans and the Pakistanis, which was a really critical piece. And part of it, and the book goes on, the chapter goes on to describe, was we think we have the deal, but how do we politically lock it in so that no one can renege? Well, one of the best ways to lock in a deal is a photo op. Make it official. Do a handshake. Do a signing with the banners. Get it into press releases. Very hard for people to walk back from that when they go home, right? And so the chapter ends with how we asked the World Bank to put together a really impromptu. We pulled it together within 24 hours. The bank team pulled it together. We got the deal, I think it was on a Friday night. By Saturday morning, it was raining. I remember this was a rainy, cold day in DC. I left my kids in their pajamas, threw on an outfit, drove to 17th Street Northwest in DC at the World Bank. Jim Kim, who was the president at the time, presided over a signing ceremony with the finance ministers from the region to lock in the deal. The press went out the next minute. And so I share stories like that because I think it's really important, not that we just do the modeling pieces of it, but what does it take to politically, culturally get that deal done? And I know we're short on time, Salimah, so I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit.
I was going to say, so what does this mean for
Yeah.
our students? And what would you tell yourself at age 23?
So all of you have handouts here, right? And for those of you online, I think it's in the chat as well. Is that right? Okay, so we sent online chat in the chat as well. There's two pieces in the book, and so I just blew them up and sent it and gave them to all of you. What I wish I knew when I was in your shoes. So first, if you're in academia, I designed a curriculum. I took my shot at it, although I'm not an expert in this, but I took my shot at it. And I go through the courses I wish I took. Some of them I did take, but I didn't take all of them. And the competencies that you may want to think about before you graduate, right? So it's things like, in addition to your technical area of expertise, you may be coming at it from a development perspective, economics, statistics, etc. Whatever your technical area of competency is, supplement with other stuff that you may not have to take, like psychology, negotiation theory and how to negotiate, right? Budgeting. If you cannot read a budget, you can't work in development, and you can't really work in diplomacy either. Understanding budgets and negotiations, and politics. How many of you here want to run for politics, run for office, and be a politician? How many of you here want to be a bureaucrat? I have this next book idea already in my head because I've been surveying this question, and it's fascinating your generation because I'm getting zeros on this. I don't know what the chat said here. If anyone raised their hands in the chat, no one. Okay, so we're at zero. Zero people here raised their hands to run for office or to be a bureaucrat. I want you all to check in with each other because this is your network. I want you to check in with each other 15 years from now and see how many of you are bureaucrats. I bet it's at least half this room. How many of you will have to work with politicians to get your work through, do you think?
Yeah.
All of you should be raising your hands.
Yeah, exactly.
How many of you will have to work with bureaucrats, even if you're not a bureaucrat? All of you guys, raise your hands. You're all going to have to do this. If you want to do the transformative change, whether you're coming at this from international relations or international development, you have to work with bureaucrats, technocrats, politicians, donors, right? Media, social media, bloggers, the whole gamut, right? So even if you're only going to be one of those things, and that's what you're training to do, my best advice is learn how to work with everybody else too, and learn what it takes for them to succeed. Because if you don't understand what it takes for them to succeed, you can't convince them to do what you want. You can't just show up with your report that has the best analysis and the best recommendations for climate and not understand the political and budgetary pressures that member faces from his or her own constituents. You're not persuasive because you're talking in a vacuum. And you're talking about your world and you're not talking about mine. And my entire career has been about different worlds intersecting each other. And if I'm going to succeed in any of those worlds, I have to understand not my world, I have to understand yours, right? So that's some of the pieces I put on the course. And then on there's 21 recommendations in the book because I published it in 2021, so it's as simple as that. But in 21 recommendations. And in the 21 recommendations, there's 6 areas of competencies that I really urge you to focus on, and it's about money, really understanding how money is spent, not how much, but impact around money. It's around bureaucracy. If you don't understand organizational bureaucracy, you cannot make change. It doesn't matter where you work. You cannot make change if you don't understand organizational bureaucracy. It's around politics. Politics are the DNA of our society. Who makes change? Who makes change? Politicians. Who makes change? People, people, people. People can be politicians, they can work in institutions, organizations, academia, civil society, but it's people, it's this. We make change, or we stand in the way of it. Or we're passive and we just don't care, so we don't invest in it, right? So it's people. So you have to understand the politics of people for this to work. Language. How many of you study a foreign language? I bet everybody here in some way, shape, or form. Foreign language is not the only way to think about language. Foreign languages are very important. Important to have as many language skills as you have, but it's not the only way to think about the word language. Language is the art of understanding how the other works. The other can be a person, but the other is often an institution. An institution. If I want to lobby Harvard to change something, I have to understand how Harvard works as an institution. Right? Emotional intelligence. This is a harder one to study and teach or learn, I appreciate. But so key of the body language, the eye contact, right? The perceptions of the other. Trust comes from emotional intelligence, right? In the Afghanistan-Pakistan case, I wager, even in Pakistan, Alina, at the end of the day, you and I are negotiating over this, you for the Pakistani side, me for the American side. We could agree on the policy, we could agree on the prescriptions, we could agree on everything the paper said. But at the end of the day, maybe you didn't like me, and you just didn't trust me. And you didn't trust the US, and you just didn't trust the Americans were going to hold the deal. That could be enough for the whole thing to fall apart, right? Trust, emotional intelligence, diversity. The book talks a lot about diversity, but for all of you and for each of you, when you're the kind of change you're trying to transform and do is to shift who is in power and who has power. And all of you now, just by being part of this institution, or being part of any elite institution that online that you may be connected to, whether it's Harvard or any other elite institution in the world, frankly, just by being at this top, right, have power. You have power. So you got to decide what you're going to do with that. And you have to decide what you're going to do with it in terms of diversity, not just so that you get to be in the room, but that others can also be in the room and we can diversify this entire piece, because development diplomacy only works culturally also when there's diversity. And I don't just mean my race, gender, sexual identity. I mean diversity of geography, right? And I don't mean just the number of countries. I mean who in countries. Are we only getting people at capitals represented? Or do we actually get local representation? Do we get local women NGO leaders who actually get to decide what the deal is going to look like versus it being imposed from London or Brussels or Washington, right? So even diversity of geography matters a lot. So those are some of the things I wish I knew when I was in your shoes as I was starting out my career. There's a lot of other stories in there as well. And I hope this is a helpful guide for each of you of options for you to consider. I'll just end really quickly, Salimah, by saying that, you know, to the time, it's just to say, I know that this is my journey and my story, and it may not be applicable to yours at all, but I hope it shows you a little bit more of what it really takes to get into some of these spaces, and then once you're there, how to succeed. Because sometimes getting the job is not the hardest part. It's what to do when you get the job. It's what to do when you actually get there and you have a platform to make change and you're trying to figure out how to do it. So the book is called The Development Diplomat. Would love to get your feedback, your thoughts on it. Do share the word, it just came out. And I really thank you for your interest.
Thank you very much. It is 5:30, but I think I want to take just one set of questions and then, you know, we can decide what to do before. Are you okay with that, Fatima? Fantastic. So if you have any questions, we'll do a set of 4 questions. So if you could raise your hands, and Sarah in the back has a microphone. She can hand one to you. Claire, we have a question in the back as well. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for being with us here today. We're just rolling off of COP26, and Biden has made a lot of statements about U.S. commitments to developing countries as far as financing goes. What do you see MCC's role being in increasing financing to developing countries, and what structures do you already have in place, like the American Catalyst Facility for Development, to try and push that forward?
Thank you.
So,
Claire, how many, sorry, just one second. How many questions do we have in the? Just one. One? Okay. So we'll take 3 in the room and 1 for Claire.
have there been instances where you were faced with a lack of understanding of the local context that you went into, and what was your approach to that situation?
And tell me your name.
I'm Roy.
I can't hear you.
Roy.
Roy? Yeah. What was your name?
I'm Alina. In a lot of countries, political dynamics are changing in the sense that more authoritarian rulers are coming to power. In Afghanistan, we've seen that the Taliban has come to power, and in countries like Pakistan, the military is becoming increasingly more dominant. So as one of the leaders of the MCC, how do you view your sort of attitude to negotiating with these types of actors?
Okay, this question is from Stefania from the chat. She asked, is it true that the best way to establish good diplomatic relations is through establishing good interpersonal relations?
Excellent question. We have. We'll go for it. Thank you.
Sorry, what was the name of the person in the chat?
Stefania.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know why you decided to leave the US government and what it is that you are able to do now in your role at MCC that you may not have been able to do in your role at the US government. My name is Lucy.
Thank you, Fatima. Thank you so much for the book. I'm guessing it's for us.
Well, these are for you guys to look at, and then if you'd like to purchase, let me know.
Yes, I'd like to purchase one. And I appreciate the fact that it's written in a very personal way. It's not too technical. I skimmed through a few pages. I would like to know if you can speak a little bit about the issue about language. And you said that the diplomats need to be able to voice constructive dissent from time to time. I'm wondering if you can give us an example in your professional life where you didn't lose your job because you had a different opinion and how you managed that experience. And my name is Daniel.
Thank you. Okay, let me try to clump some of these.
Great.
Okay. Okay, let me do this in 2 different buckets. First, I'm going to go backwards a little bit. Daniel, I'll start with you. So I share examples in the book about this about constructive dissent. This is this phrase I think a lot about. It's actually one of my North Stars. I think I can get away with this because I'm the personality type that is not in any institution for my entire career. And I'm willing to be somewhere 3 to 5 years, make some noise if needed, and then either stay or move or whatever, right? And I think that helps me able to think like that and do that. I always think in any job I have, I try not to think too much about the future. I always try to think in this moment, I have this opportunity and I can make impact now. What can I do with that in ways that have long-term impact, whether or not I'm in the job or not, right? And so I give this example, one of the examples I give here, it's in chapter 7, and it's called Pumping and Dumping in War Zones, and you can read it to figure out why it's called that, but I ran this 2-year, I realized after being on the committee for a while that I had all this evidence around that we were losing the war in Afghanistan, and that we in particular were not spending our assistance dollars as effectively as we could, right? And I just decided I'm going to pull it all together and see what the evidence says. Because I spent months pulling all of this together, And I write this story, and it's a very kind of vulnerable story in many ways, at the behind the scenes of what it took to publish this report. And it was very controversial because it basically put our members on the Democratic side, who were the, representing up to the chairman of SFRC, in a position where if we published these findings, we would be critiquing a Democratic White House, right? And Washington doesn't typically work like that. It's very easy if you're on the Republican side to go after the Democrats and vice versa. But we don't see as much anymore evidence-based critiques that could then become politicized, right? And so there's a very, very fine line between how to do that. And when I joined the committee, I remember, and I share this in the book, I remember one of the first meetings that then Senator Kerry had with all of us. Staff. He sat us down, and he was very vulnerable and honest with us about his experiences in Vietnam and how that shaped his entire humanity and his entire outlook on life. And he said to us, at the end of the day, I need you to do what you think is right and tell me what you think is right, even if it's unpopular. That's your job. Your job is to tell me the truth, even if it's unpopular. I'll decide what I do with that, right? And I don't know, maybe I was young, maybe I was naive. I was like, all right. I took him at his word. I literally took him at his word for that. And I decided I would write it down. So I spent months writing this report. And I talk in the book about the negotiations it took to actually get from the idea to getting it published and the green light politically, internally, of what it took to get it published. And I use that as an example of constructive dissent because it really wasn't a popular political view to do this, right? At the end of the day, I have to say the courage that I think he showed in publishing it in his name and putting himself and the committee out there, to me, it still stays in my heart in many ways of what courageous leadership really looks like. That's about the national interest and not personal or political interest, right? You can see above partisanship. And so I share that story because I think sometimes we're so caught up in this moment of time that this could be really an unpopular thing to do within an organization or an institution or across the board out there. And it could be like, you could put an op-ed out that could be really unpopular, for instance, et cetera. And we're so worried about this moment in time that we lose sight of the impact it can have down the line. And I'll say, even though the report did cause waves, I mean, it was the front page of the Post, Washington Post, New York Times, when it got issued, definitely made waves, all across the political airspaces. It also helped change and create this change needed within USAID and others to do what many people wanted to do for years anyway, but they needed political cover to do, right? And I heard from so many ambassadors, I heard from USAID foreign service officials and others. We've been saying this for years, but we didn't get the political cover to be able to make these changes, right? And so that's what I mean a little bit about constructive dissent. And it's really, you got to pick your moments. I wouldn't be politically suicidal all the time, right? Not great for the job market and your job prospects, but pick your moments, but pick something not only that you're passionate about, but something you know a lot about, like grounded in evidence and fact. And I think that can help your cause. I do think that for diplomacy and diplomatic relationships, there's a lot to it. Knowing politics, history, culture, economics really matters, but people matter too, as we've talked a lot about in these talks. I do think interpersonal relationships are very key. Much more challenging in our virtual environment in some ways because we can't do this as much in person anymore. On the other hand, technology has also even and leveled the playing field where you can have conversations with people in places that normally would be too expensive or out of reach. So making sure we can use both sides of the coin. On authoritarianism, political dynamics, let me do local context, and I'll end with the MCC pieces. On local context. So Roy, you asked the question. The answer is every single time. I mean, I travel to so many countries around the world. I'm not an expert in all these countries. I cannot be by default, right? I'm a generalist. So I think first of it, you have to have a lot of humility when you're working in different countries or different contexts. They don't have to be countries. They could be cities, towns, villages, provinces, right? Having a lot of humility about what you don't know and And second is really there are experts everywhere if you can tap into that local expertise. So I really try very hard when I travel to meet outside of my bubble. I always say I want to meet out of my bubble, not just my team and my guys or gals, but really who are the local experts, NGO leaders, private sector leaders, who are others in that space, journalists, who are others in that space that can have voice, and often just taking a meeting with them changes that entire dynamic as well. So, you know, I think having the humility to be like, I don't know the local context, that is a game changer. I think it's very hard sometimes when people come in and they make all these assumptions, and then you have to course correct them in real time. So that's something I face a lot. Look, I love serving. I will just say to all of you, serving public service is the passion of my life. It really is the passion of my life. And I'm very proud to be a public servant, because if you want to make change, you got to go into the guts of an organization, you got to go into the guts of governments and go make the change, right? You can lobby on the outside a lot, but if you want to actually go do it, you got to go inside the guts and go make the change on the ground. I was very privileged to serve in lots of different capacities. I had a great 15-year run. When the administrations changed back in 2018, I, you know, ultimately because I represented the United States abroad in so many countries and represented any presidential administration, I had to really think if this was something I morally was prepared to do, and I got to the point where it did not align with my values and my value statement, and I did not want to put myself in a position where I could not defend policies that I did not believe in at the end of the day. And I had a really good run for 15 years, so I decided now was my time to go join civil society, which I did do. I was very honored when the Biden-Harris administration asked me to come back to serve and to rejoin MCC, an agency that I really, really love. I'll just end really quickly with on climate, on authoritarianism. I think those are, I answered all the other questions. I mean, a couple things. So the Millennium Challenge Corporation is an independent U.S. foreign government agency. You know, one of the trademarks of MCC is that we use a scorecard to really incentivize low-income, lower-middle-income countries and others who qualify for our 100% grant assistance to use a scorecard based on economic rights, democratic rights, and freedoms to perform well against themselves and to keep doing better and better. It's called the MCC effect. And so we only work in those spaces. So where you see the rise of authoritarianism or clampdown, that's reflected on our scorecards, and that triggers conversations of whether or not we're even eligible to work there. And so we use independent third-party metrics to make some of those decisions as a way to create democratic incentives for countries and leaders to do the right around economic rights and freedoms. And on climate, I'll just end really quickly by saying, you know, we're still in COP26 in Glasgow, so I'm not making any commitments or statements officially in this capacity from the US government, but I think this is a moment where everyone's got to lean in. I'm proud to work at an agency that's leaning in on climate in lots of different ways, including climate strategy that's on our website that we put out, where all of our program investments, at least 50% of our investments, will have a climate component going forward. So that's a huge commitment for an agency like ours, building on a lot of our core strengths. We were an early mover on climate, and we have lots of different mechanisms and ways to do that. Some of our blended finance mechanisms that you cited, Mackenzie, are ways that we can think about that, but we have many other tools as well, including economic analytical tools that we're using to be able to do that. So Salimah, let me pause there. I think I tried to answer most of those questions, but let me pause there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So in her book, Fatima talks about the mandate her father gave her during her childhood to fight for others to have opportunity. And I think your father would be very proud of you, Fatima. I'd like to close with a quote by Toni Morrison, which is included in the book. And I quote, "When you get these jobs that you have brilliantly been trained for, just remember that your real job is that you are free. You need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. It doesn't matter to me what your position is." Thank you, Fatima, for writing the book and for the courage it took to share so much of yourself, of how hard it has been to raise 3 children and still do what it is that you dream to do and make your father proud. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Sarah Luttrell and Claire for helping organize and manage this event. Thank you very much. And to CID and to the Women in Public Policy Program for co-sponsoring this event. Thank you all for joining us and for asking great questions. And thank you all of you who joined us virtually. Thank you very much. Now we can applaud.